Well, when you try to explain to younger people today that once the biggest stars on Australian TV were journalists on a show that aired once a week, after dinner, on a Sunday night, they look at you rather strangely. That was the story, though, of 60 Minutes. It was the biggest show of the week for decades, airing for the first time in 1979. It was a show that genuinely changed television and made its reporters household names. And so today we learned of the sad news of the passing of the great George Negus at 82 years of age. George was an icon. He was a giant of the show, a genuine broadcasting legend, one of the most recognisable faces on Australian television for nearly 5 decades. And 60 Minutes was an extraordinary program in television's golden age, and those blokes back then were larger than life.
I'm Ian Leslie.
I'm George Negus.
I'm Ray Martin.
Folk knew at home that familiar sound, the tick, tick, tick and everything else that came with it, they knew 60 Minutes, let's go down and sit down and watch it. And they knew that for the next hour of their life, that's what they were going to do. And they took it seriously.
Real independence only came to Zimbabwe after 7 years of black versus white war. For years, they've been using the paths in these mountains. The Israelis won't admit that they've got the bomb.
Why do people stop us in the street almost and tell us that Margaret Thatcher isn't plain pig-headed?
The application for membership of the clan spells it out. I swear an unqualified allegiance to the white race. Lonely old George here is a classic example of how man can upset nature if he really puts his mind to it.
I don't think we thought we were just journalists. We were deliverers. We were actually doing something that a lot of Australians, had never done before. They'd never watched television for 15 or 50 more minutes every Sunday night.
Regardless of how aligned or non-aligned the nations gathered here say they are, probably the most intriguing factor about this whole huge international affair is that America, a mere 90 miles away to the north, still refuses officially to recognise that the host nation, Cuba, even exists.
I was an ex-school teacher, ex-high school teacher, and I sort of climbed my way into journalism somehow, and I've always been fascinated by what makes places and people and politics in particular tick. Politics is the best way to solve problems without killing each other. No matter how bad it is, it's better than the alternative. So, it was an opportunity to talk to Australians about things that they might not otherwise talk about or find out about.
Being here and seeing how the people live, it's certainly easy to see why Trenchtown doesn't make it onto the travel brochure.
It was like being in their living room, whether they liked it or not. So I'm sorry, folks, for all those times I walked in and wasn't invited. But it became important to me, with my background, whatever it turned out to be, that a lot of ordinary Australians were not being treated with the right respect. They were treating like they were idiots because they watched commercial television. Well, what we're doing turned out to be a little bit better than idiotic. Most of it.
George Negus, what a career, and that's only a tiny part of it, of course. I worked at 9 during the Negus era. We'd occasionally bump into each other. It was like meeting one of your heroes, really, and I remember turning up on holidays in places where George turned up in. I don't know how that happened. My guest, Ian Leslie, was one of the original reporters on the show as well. He worked alongside George and Ray Martin as the program began in 1979. Ian Leslie, thank you very much for speaking to us, and condolences on George's passing.
Thank you, Chris. It was expected. It was just a question of when, because we'd known that George was fading away for about 2 years now, a little bit longer than that. But you never really thought the moment would come. And when it did arrive this afternoon, I thought, bloody hell, he's gone. It really left you with an empty feeling.
Do you remember the last conversation you had with him?
Yeah, we had a big argument. Was at a lunch with Ray, George and Gerald Stone. I brought them together. It was the last time the three of us all got together. And I don't know what the argument was about, but it wasn't hard to get into a stoush with George because he had an opinion on everything. But it was all good-hearted. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't nasty. And so I enjoyed it very much. It was a very spirited lunch, and we covered a lot about 60 Minutes, but just contemporary times as well.
In many ways, we thought we knew you all because you were very much part of our television diet on a Sunday night. But we thought that George was the larrikin that was almost the same as the Prime Minister we had in the late 80s, Bob Hawke. He was a fellow you couldn't help but like.
Yes, you certainly you would never forget a meeting with George, but he had an extraordinary personality. He was powerful. He was unashamedly out there. He never had any pretense about him. A lot of people would say, "Oh, George is play acting like the urban cowboy because he used to love wearing his jacket over his shoulder." No, it wasn't the case at all. He was just comfortable like that, and he had that marvelous ability to absorb information, images, and then translate that to his audience. And that was absolutely imperative. And working with him was an absolute pleasure, as it was with Ray. And we were like brothers in a personal sense, even though there was some rivalry, but it never got to the point where you wouldn't help, you wouldn't assist. In fact, I remember working back in newsrooms where the rivalry could get quite toxic, where you do anything to beat your mate to the lead story. That wasn't the case in 60 Minutes. We helped each other, we shared information, and if Gerald Stone, God bless him, said, "Ian, would you mind giving George this story, because at the moment he hasn't got a story to do," I'd say yes, no problem.
Yeah. You mentioned about entertainment and reportage. There's that fine line in television journalism between being a facts, who, what, where, now, how figure, and a little bit of an entertainer. He seemed to have the perfect balance. Would you agree?
Absolutely. There was a real... George had an incredible sense of humour, and he had no pretense about not being entertaining because he understood we were essentially in the entertainment industry.
Yes.
It's no good being pious and being all journalistically correct if you're not going to be watched or listened to. And we all understood that. George probably played it a little bit more than Ray and I, because we'd come from more conservative backgrounds than George. George was a political animal, and he'd had quite a strong political career before that. You know, he was Lionel Murphy, the Attorney General's press secretary. He knew Bob Hawke very well. So George used that sense of humour to cut through, get his message across. And I always think that he was the spark that we really needed to get that program launched. He was the spark that took us to an amazing audience.
Darren Hinch told a funny story this afternoon, Ian, and it does explain to, I think, our audience the difference between a reporter for a newspaper and the reporters that came through the 60 Minutes era. He told of seeing Negus in a hotel room one night, sprawled on the bed, scribbling on a yellow legal pad. Hinch asked, "Is your typewriter broken?" And George's answer was, "I can't type."
Typing wasn't really that important, but he was a two-fingered typist. I think most of us were, and he very quickly learned because the pressure was on, and you had to turn out. We were each averaging about 30 stories a year in those first 3 years, which was just an incredible amount of work to do. But no, that's whether he could or not, I'm not sure. I did see him at a typewriter a lot of times, but that may have been Negus's rich sense of humour.
Yeah. Great memories. What's the thing you'll miss most about him?
I will miss the lunches. I will miss the debates. I will miss him as a friend, and I will miss him as a colleague.